Good evening, this is Mr. Wintermelon, and in this video you are going to learn what is a reflex action. So by the end of this video, you should be able to discuss the function of brain and spinal cord in producing a coordinated response as a result of a specific stimulus in a reflex action. So you can see the star in this chapter is the reflex action, our golden boy. So, whenever I talk about reflex action, you must pay attention. But first of all, let us discuss what are the two types of actions which our body produces. First, we have our voluntary action. That means things we volunteer to do, or whatever we want to do. For example, killing yourself. You can choose to kill yourself or not kill yourself. So this one is a voluntary action. Things that you have control over is what we call voluntary action. Whether you want to stare at the car or the chobu beside the car is your choice. Then we have our involuntary actions, which is the main focus in this video. But there are two types of involuntary actions. The first are those automatic actions. For example, our heartbeat, peristalsis, vasodilation, and contraction. We cannot control our heartbeat in the sense that actually we can kill ourselves, then our heart will stop beating, or we can choose to go and run, then our heart will beat faster. But we cannot command our heart to just pump faster or just stop pumping. This one we cannot control. Peristalsis, when we eat our food, it cannot be, we tell our stomach, stomach don't push our food down. Peristalsis don't happen. We do not have control over this. Or for the example of vasodilation, let's say you have your morning wood, you cannot control your morning wood. So those are automatic actions. Next is our starman of this chapter, which is reflex action. For example, when we hit our knee will jerk up. When we touch a hot or sharp object, our hand will immediately withdraw from it. The size of our pupil, when we enter a dark room, it will automatically becomes bigger. So those are the reflex action, things that we do not have a direct control over it, but our brain can still exert some influence, which you will learn later on. Before we continue, let us compare voluntary action against reflex action. For voluntary action, it is always initiated from our brain. For example, if we decided to kill ourselves, our brain will initiate the action potential. So the nerve impulse will be transmitted through the motor neuron to our effector, for example, our leg, then we will jump. In the case of reflex action, it is always triggered by an external stimulus. For example, let's say we touch something sharp, then we up. So what happened will be the external stimulus will trigger the receptor. Then from the receptor, the signal will be transmitted through the sensory and finally reaching the relay neuron. The relay neuron can be inside the spinal cord or it can be inside the brain. So it need not necessarily pass through the brain for reflex action. Then you pass through the motor neuron and finally to the effector. So this slide nicely compare the similarity as well as difference of a voluntary action and a reflex action. So the similarity is both of them involve motor neurons, both of them will result in an effect. The difference is voluntary action is always initiated by the brain, while reflex action is triggered by external stimulus. And for the reflex action, it involves the sensory neuron, as well as it can involve the relay neuron in the spinal cord. In the case of voluntary action, we must be the one that think what we want to do and trigger the voluntary action. Now, let us bring our focus to our star attraction, which is reflex action. So reflex actions are rapid and automatic responses to specific stimuli, which will always causes an immediate response. So unlike our heartbeat, reflex action will need to be stimulated. So there's a difference between automatic action and reflex action. But both are involuntary action because we do not have direct control over it. For heartbeat, we totally don't have control. For reflex action, our brain can still control it. The next term that you need to know is reflex arc. Reflex arc is used to refers to the shortest pathway by which nerve impulses travel from receptor to the effector in a reflex action. Now you might notice that shortest pathway is being highlighted down here. Then you might want to go back to the previous slide and say, hey, the involuntary action, the pathway seems a bit longer than the voluntary pathway. But when we are talking about reflex arc, we are talking about the shortest pathway in a reflex action. Later on, you will see that there are actually more than one pathway. I will talk about the two pathway later on so that this will be clear. So what are the components of a reflex arc? Again, this is nothing new. You will have the receptor, sensory neuron, the relay neuron or the integration center, motor neuron, and the effector. There are two types of reflex action. The cranial reflex action, which are all the reflex action that are in our head, and spinal reflex, which are the reflex action that are below our head. So for cranial reflexes, the relay neuron is in our brain, while for spinal reflexes, the relay neuron is in our spinal cord. So let us take a look at the two pathway and why the reflex arc is known as the shortest pathway. So let's say our finger touch a hot bowl of soup. What will happen is the receptor will sense the heat, then it will send an action potential to the relay neuron. From the axon terminal, the signal will go through the synapse into the relay neuron, and from the relay neuron, the signal will travel into the motor neuron, and finally, the motor neuron will transmit the action potential to the effector, where a action will occur. So this one is actually the shortest pathway. Let us take a look at the longer pathway. Again, the scenario is the same. Our finger touch a hot bowl of soup. So the receptor will sense the increase in temperature and send an action potential to the relay neuron. However, two things will happen, and this is what happened in all the scenarios. The previous scenario where I'm showing the reflex arc is only one of the two pathways. So what you will see in a short while is the reflex arc and the longer pathway. What will happen is this action potential will be sent to two directions. One is through the relay neuron to the motor neuron. The other one is through the relay neuron to our brain. So let us take a look. So you can see the reflex arc being completed, but at the same time, information will be sent to our brain. Because without this information, we will not feel the pain. We will not feel that it is hot. Our brain is the organ that gives us perception of pain and gives us perception of hotness. Our spinal cord doesn't provide this information. Our spinal cord will only cause our hand to withdraw. Our brain will feel the pain. So at the same time, our brain will feel the pain, but because we do not want to drop our soup, so the brain will send signal to the motor neuron through the relay neuron from the brain. So this signal will tell our muscle to hang in there. Muscle, do not drop my soup. So these are the two pathways. The shorter pathway is known as the reflex action, and that will be the main thing that you have to know. But it will also be important for you to know that the other pathway that travels to the brain will allow us to feel the pain. And also, our brain will receive the information and is able to send signal to stop the reflex action. But instinctively, our hand will want to withdraw from the hot object. But because you are carrying it to maybe have for your breakfast, your hand should not withdraw from it. So your brain can send a signal to block the withdrawal. So example of reflex action put in words. Definitely copy this down. The receptor in our skin will sense the heat, which will cause an action potential to be produced. The sensory neuron will transmit the action potential to our spinal cord. In our spinal cord, at the axon terminal, neurotransmitter will be released across the synapse, and the neurotransmitter will trigger an action potential. Then at the end of the relay neuron, information will again be transmitted by the neurotransmitter to the motor neuron, and our motor neuron will carry the action potential to the effector. And our effector or our muscle will contract, withdrawing our hand from the hot object. So if they ask you to describe a reflex action or name reflex action, you can use this as an example. So beside withdrawal of hand, another reflex action is the dilation as well as contraction of our pupil. For this, we have to know more about our eyes, and you will learn this in the next video.